Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, Megan Fox stops in. She's going to connect the dots on societal influences on vulnerable children. Jon is with us today as well. Jon, great to have you on the show and back. We've got you got a heck of a lineup today, don't you? You got a lot to discuss with Megan. She too is a former broadcaster of radio for over 20 years, and she also brings with her a world of knowledge, having had the time to spend with multiple journalistic endeavors since leaving her radio career, and she has her own show as well. Maybe we can start there today.
Yeah, Brad, it's my pleasure to introduce to the audience, to some, and bring back to the attention of others, Megan Fox. Megan, thank you so much for being a part of our program here. You were good enough to have me on yours. We talked about kind of darker things, minds of psychopaths, which is part of my background, hopefully not being a psychopath, but working with men. But you have quite the programs. You're on multiple platforms. Introduce yourself for our audience. You write for PJ Media, and then you have a number of different programs.
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I write for PJ Media, and thanks for having me here. Just a small correction. My broadcasting career is the one I'm doing now, but going back 20 years, I've been in journalism for about 20 years and worked in radio stations in various areas, getting to know how radio stations work, which was always a thrill for me because I'm a big AM radio fan. News talk radio is my favorite thing ever. So I was able to work in mainstream press at ABC for a couple years, working for 4 different radio stations. That was back in the 90s. And it was quite a time. It was quite a time for the heyday of AM radio, of the giants of talk, Rush Limbaugh and Jim Rome and Dr. Laura and just so many of those giant radio personalities. So it was fun to learn. And then I got into writing, and mostly opinion columns for a while. That's how I started out, was basically political punditry. But as my skills grew and I went to school and I took some journalism classes. I've never been one to really throw myself into college, but I would like to take specialized classes that I wanted to take. So I started taking journalism courses, and I started covering news for a small blog in Chicago, and traveled to the RNC in 2004 and covered that for the blog. And I really found that journalism was something that I really liked doing, getting out on the street, talking to people, reporting stories, reporting on the at the time, the 2004 convention, RNC in New York. There were all kinds of protests at Ground Zero, and there was all sorts of things that I was right in the middle of and reporting for this blog in Chicago. And it led to being hired to write for David Horowitz's website. He was starting a website. He was the author of Front Page Magazine. David Horowitz is a famous conservative that used to be a hippie from
That's
the 60s.
Right. He certainly was not a conservative at one point in time.
No, he wrote this amazing book called The Prodigal Son. And it was about his transformation from being with the Weather Underground and Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn and being in the Weather Underground to coming around to conservatism. And he's an amazing man. I give him all the credit for bringing me into my career and giving me a chance to write back then when I was a very young woman and just looking for somebody to give me a chance. And David Horowitz did. And he was an amazing boss. I framed my first dollar I ever made there, my first check. I framed it. I told my Dad, I've finally done it. You can finally be proud. David Horowitz is one of his favorite authors. So he was very impressed by that. And I worked for Newsreel blog for several years until David decided he didn't want to do the blog anymore. He wanted to focus on the magazine. I moved over to pjmedia.com with one of my editors that I met there, and I've been there ever since. I've been at PJ Media for probably, I think, 8 years now, and I've done much more investigative journalism since I've been there. That really is a true passion of mine because I see that the media and I think everyone can see that the media is very lazy. Rush Limbaugh nailed them completely when he called them the drive-by press. You know, they drive by, they spray bullets into a crowd, and they drive off, and everyone is bleeding and injured, and nobody knows what actually happened. That's how they treat news stories. You know, they treat news stories like they get as much as they can get out of it in the moment, and then they move on to something else, regardless of how many mistakes they make. True investigative journalism takes a lot of time. It takes talking to witnesses. It takes months of investigation, sometimes over a year. I have stories I've been working on over a year that I've never breathed a word of yet because I'm still working them. And it's not about getting who's first, you know, which is what all of news is today. It's about beating the next guy to the headline to be first. And being first necessarily means you're going to miss details that you shouldn't have missed, and that people will then be misled by, which is why we have such a problem with fake news, because it isn't about accuracy, it's about who's first. And I don't do that anymore. I could do news aggregation. It definitely pays more. It's certainly easier for me to do writing. You know, I could write 40 articles a month just aggregating what's in the headlines. But I prefer to find my own stories and investigate them deeply and look at both sides. I do write for conservative news, but I often expose Republicans for their spinelessness, and for the fact that they're no different than Democrats when it comes to protecting society, when it comes to pushing forward conservative ideas. And I name them and I shame them on a regular basis because to me, they're worse than the other side. These are people who are supposed to know better. They're supposed to know that government corruption is bad. They're supposed to know that government should be small. And yet they're digging into the trough the same way the other side is. And, you know, they're doing their insider trading and not going to jail for it. They're doing a lot of things they shouldn't be doing. And I think in investigative journalism, and journalism today suffers because journalists have taken a side and they want to prop up their side instead of hold their side accountable. And I would rather hold Republicans accountable for the things they promise and the things they actually do.
Megan, that's why it's exciting for me to have you on, because the issue of the trans movement, in my estimation, has been really the greatest man-made, so it's contrived, man-made scheme, scam, and ruse ever to be created or come down the pike. And so much of what is contained under the umbrella of now, quote unquote, trans, which again is a manufactured term. People need to understand that there is no such thing as a trans person, trans kid. There are people and there are kids that are confused. And they're confused because they've been groomed. And then Jennifer Billick of the 11th Hour blog, brilliant woman who has, I highly recommend you get her on your program, Megan. She has connected the dots of the financial interests and the deep pockets as far as Pritzkers and others who have funded this and what their agenda is. And so what's so valuable in my estimation, having somebody like you on, that you have your finger on the pulse and have had it for years on the different ways the media has become complicit in either not covering, right? We can push an agenda overtly or covertly, passively or actively. And you've had your finger on the pulse of a lot of different things that now fall under the trans movement as far as moving society in a certain way, shifting cultures, sexualizing kids. And speaking of Rush Limbaugh, your name kind of was suddenly being spoken of in households because he referenced. And so I'm excited about this in two ways. For anybody that comes from, let's say, a conservative bent. Now, this program isn't necessarily politically oriented, but we cover anything. So whether politics, whether religion, anything that's being used to further this agenda, and ultimately this agenda is about making, as far as the trans movement, the trans agenda is all about making, gaining access to the private spaces and private parts of vulnerable women and children, ultimately toward, in my estimation, relegating women, and people find this controversial, but I don't care, right? Ultimately relegating women to sex slaves in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about barefoot and pregnant, but even worse, in a very denigrated way, right? When you threaten women to where they cannot speak anymore and you call them TERFs, you're now, you're seriously silencing women. When women are trying to speak up about guys in their locker room and the sports teams, you're silencing them. They're eradicating women's sports, now men and women's prisons. So women's voices are being silenced. This is a tremendous threat. So you had begun speaking out about cultural issues. Rush Limbaugh referenced an article that you had written about your concerns that this is a very real, this is creating, meaning the sexual revolution and certain things that certain sexual orientations are doing is creating a health crisis. Why don't you mention what Rush read about 5 years ago on the air?
Sure.
It's really catapulted you into the public eye.
You know, what's interesting is that that article was probably one of the first times that I started really comparing news stories and finding a news story between what was being reported. You know, like the media has a narrative that they want to push. And every day you go online and you see the top stories, they're going to be very similar. And you'll see that they're all aggregating it from the same source. And they put in, like you said, about what they don't cover is just as important as what they do cover. And so at the time, it was 5 years ago, and there was this big story in the LA Times, and it was about how the new AIDS pandemic was going to be anal cancer in the gay community. They were calling it the new AIDS in the LA Times. And I'm reading through it. And throughout this entire article, I realized what was left out. What was left out was, why are the cases of HPV spreading so rapidly in the gay community? Because that's what was causing the anal cancer. And there were just no answers in this article about how to prevent the spread of this HPV or why it was happening in the first place. So I did some research. I went to the American Academy of Medical Academy papers, and I found another article. I don't remember which place it was, but it was about how HPV was spreading in people specifically who were engaging in anal sex, including women. So HPV is more easily spread through anal sex. And there's studies on it. And I found them. And the studies were saying that the women who contracted anal cancer were only the women who practiced anal sex or used anal sex toys. The HPV could be transferred that way as well. And obviously the gay community has a bigger problem because of anal sex, right? So this is the thing that the LA Times left out. So here they're explaining that there's this new epidemic and how dangerous it is, and people are dying. And it really illustrated to me that they don't care that people are dying, because they're not interested to tell people why they're dying. And they're not interested in telling people what they can do to stop it, because they would have to say, maybe anal sex is not good for you. Maybe this is actually what's causing it, and this is something that should be stopped or curbed or refrained from. God forbid anybody should have any kind of self-control. That's not something that anybody wants to tell anyone these days. So I put those two articles together. And I just illustrated how absurd it was for the LA Times to have this big scare story about how people are dying and gay men are dying, and yet leave out the most important part, which is why, the why. So when I read news stories like that and I see that there's a why missing, or a who, or a what, or a where, I know they're hiding something, and that's what I go for. I find that thing that they left out, and then I've done this multiple times and come up with huge stories because the media was purposefully leaving out the why or the who. So Rush, God bless him, I had worked for him before, and I never knew if he remembered who I was, because I worked for his syndicator before I went to work for WLS in Chicago. I worked for Premier Radio Networks, and I was in the marketing department, and it was for Rush Limbaugh, Dr. Laura, Jim Rome, Michael Reagan. This was the syndicator that produced all these shows, right? And my job, I was working in the office with the salespeople who sold the shows to the radio station affiliates. One of my jobs was to get signed autographs from Rush's office. So I would call them and ask them to send me a bunch of signed autograph photos, 8x10s. And then I would send them to the affiliates that requested them, or I would send them out, and I would be sending these things to radio stations all day long. Well, this is so funny. So when I moved to Rochester area in New York 6 years ago, I was asked to sit in for a 4-hour talk show here in the morning on Wham 1180 for the Bob Lonsberry show. It's a 4-hour show, and they needed a guest host, and so they asked me to come and sit in. Well, I walked into the studio that day, and what do I see? But the same signed photograph that passed through my hands that went into the envelope that went to Wham back in the day. It was the exact same one, because they would change from year to year, but it was one of the ones that I sent out. And I remember, I'm like, how cool is this? And I was going on right before Rush in that time slot. And so I got to introduce the Rochester audience to Rush at 12 o'clock, which was just a dream come true, But when Rush actually got a hold of this article, and it was the first time he mentioned me on the air, and I did a whole video of it on my YouTube channel. That's where I have my show now, Megan Fox Investigates. And I recorded him reading it, and it was so exciting because he doesn't usually read the entire article. He will reference articles, he would, in the stack of stuff, but he wouldn't read the whole thing. And that day he read the entire thing, and I made him laugh several times because of the euphemisms that I use. And it was unbelievable. I mean, this man was my hero since I was 15, and here he was. I was listening to his show every day, and I was finally like a part of it somehow. And after that, he read my articles all the time. In fact, one of my bumper spots for my podcast on PJ Media, I use him saying, "This Megan Fox, babe, all she does is write at PJ Media all day. I read her 4 times a day." I still never know, like, did he put it together? Did he remember me? Because I met him a couple of times when I was working way back when in the 90s. But because here's a picture. I met him. This was at WLS when I met him the first time. And he was at a meet and greet that I had organized for our salespeople and their advertisers to come and meet him. And a nicer guy you would never meet. He stayed there. He was being inducted into the Radio Broadcasting Hall of Fame. And he was even late for his own induction ceremony because he wanted to stay and sign everybody's thing. And they were trying to pull him away. And he was like, "Nope, not going to do. I'm going to stay here. There's a line." And he stayed there and signed for everybody. Just a terrific guy, and we miss him a lot.
Well, Megan, I remember listening to Rush Limbaugh, and I know on our audience, we have a lot of people from different lifestyles, so to speak, that will listen. And they may be turned off the fact that we're referencing Rush Limbaugh, but listen, give credit to who credit is due. Rush changed the face of radio, so to speak, as far as talk radio. He's the reason there is. But he was irreverent, as he would call it, his humor, but he would tackle issues that nobody else was tackling. And so here he references that there's a connection, and he then reads your article where you were able to connect the dots that people are not hearing. For instance, so anal sex. Yeah, there's a connection between lifestyle and then what's being pushed on kids now in deviant sex ed school, what's called sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI sex ed. So the trans movement's sex ed, with all these different books, they're pushing anal sex and all sorts of deviant sex. They're sexualizing or grooming, which means you're crossing boundaries, you're dumbing down intuition. So these kids are being encouraged then to engage in behaviors, exactly what you read about, but shock upon shock, we're now having kids, an epidemic of diseases.
And what happened at the exact same time and I mentioned it in that article. There was a third article that I referenced, and that was in Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue had just come out with an article for your 15-year-old daughter on how to perform anal sex. For 15-year-olds, that was their last print edition, by the way, because I truly believe that the outcry from I mean, I pointed it out and a bunch of other people pointed out, this is disgusting. Young girls do not need to be encouraged to engage in a behavior that is not only painful, but is dangerous. We're talking about, I was also doing research on anal prolapse and tears and fissures and things that could happen and do happen to people who are doing anal sex. This happens. And that's another thing that's underreported are the medical problems that come from anal sex, like the prolapses and the fissures and the infections. This is something that I was horrified as a mother to see that Teen Vogue, a magazine that is supposed to be aimed at teen girls to help them, be confident and grow into their teen years, to give them this dangerous medical advice at the same time the LA Times is saying there's an epidemic of anal cancer without telling anybody how. Instead, what they're saying is, oh, it's fine. You should do this. You should be doing anal sex. That's what you should be doing. It was so irresponsible, Jon. It was disgusting.
And what's behind that? What I see with my background, also working with predators, so I work with survivors and predators, it is the media now that is complicit in grooming the kids to dumb them down, to not be aware of the fact that this is a predator's heyday. 50 Shades of Grey. I was doing sex offender treatment in prison behind bars the day that movie came out on Valentine's Day. I inquired of the guys, what do you think about this? Because they have cable TV, they have block TV, so they knew it was coming out. So what a research opportunity. I asked, what do you guys think about this film? Almost to a man. And this is a full range continuum of sex offenders doing a lot of time in prison. Their statement was, well, this movie will be doing our work for us as far as grooming. So now what's happened is we've reinterpreted what used to be sexual assault as some sort of what's called kink. No, it's very deviant and it's very dangerous. And predators are very active in the ways they're going to target kids. And if we've already primed kids then to be set up to be used by predators, right? You can have a 50-year-old predator, a 40-year-old, 30. You can have a 17-year-old predator that is very happy to have single-sex bathrooms and they're going to benefit from having had their targets of opportunity believe that it's normal to have anal sex, because guess what? That's a one-way deal. Only one person's enjoying that.
Let me just interrupt for a second, Jon. I see this all leading back to big pharma, back to control of individuals' health care through big pharma. The more anal sex, the more anal tears, the more problems with that, the more AIDS involved. We've got COVID, we've got that V word, we've got a mixture of AIDS in that. We've got
abortion,
right.
Leading more abortion, more all this. The sexual revolution just props up the abortion industry. There were scandals where Planned Parenthood was handing out faulty birth control. You think that was an accident? They're not interested in keeping the birth rate low. They want the abortion rate as high as possible. That's why they flipped out when most of America said, we don't like abortion, unlimited abortion, and we're going to get rid of Roe v. Wade because it was wrong. And we want bans on abortion after a certain period of time. That's why they flipped out. The abortion industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Well,
and it always has been about that.
The jabby jab has obviously done a lot of harm in terms of, pregnancies that have been miscarriages. That is documented as well. And again, this all just leads back to Big Pharma. So with Big Pharma's ultimate trial of control here, where do you guys see this going for the transgender movement? We have a $3 trillion a year industry. Is that going to continue to grow, or will it be able to sustain itself numbers-wise, Jon? Or where would you see that heading?
It's going to expand, meaning it has to rely upon its customer base. Rare is the time. What is any industry? You point out an industry to me where you have customers for life, and that's why with Unmasking the Trans Movement, a big part of who we are is to help people connect the dots. There are very dark special interests that are feeding off the carcasses of our kids. It's graphic, it's gross, but it's telling. They're the only ones with skin in the game.
This is a good chance for you to bring up as well how that we're not transphobic, we're not homophobic, we're none of those things. We are actually proactive in the sense that we just want people to be educated and understand.
I want people to be happy, and I want them to be safe and well and healthy. And I think any society that encourages unhealthy, dangerous behaviors has lost sight of its purpose. This is a society that values chaos and death instead of life and health. That's what scares me. Pushing big pharma solutions on everyone instead of helping people get a control of their nutrition, for instance, or taking the poisons out of our food that Monsanto can keep spraying on everything. Not using, I ran into these great, and this is so interesting. So I have these two new friends in Maine. They are chapter leaders for Gays Against Groomers, Camille and Samantha, and they're a couple, and they live in a homestead in Maine, and they're amazing women, just amazingly. They're survivalists. They have their own farm. They're completely energy free. They're off the grid. They're totally off the grid, solar energy, all of that. And, it's such a better way to live. They have this incredible, they have, it's called offgridhive.com is their website. And they have this amazing way of planting an organic garden where you use other plants that keep pests away that you plant in between your different crops, right? And there's so many different and creative ways to keep poison out of our food. We don't need to eat food that has been sprayed with all of this crap, right? And this is what's causing so many allergies, kids with allergies, so many problems breaking down the human body. These alternatives are the things we need to look for. And you would love Camille and Sam, by the way. They're so funny. They're like, the least interesting thing about us is our sexuality. And the problem with people, this focus on sexuality, on hypersexuality, and on focusing on people's sexual orientation as being the most important thing about them. We see them doing it at the White House or their gender identity. We see them doing it everywhere now. In schools, they're trying to get our kids, the American School Counselor Associations want our kids to identify themselves as early as kindergarten as what they are. Well, who are they? Which is crazy. The question, who am I, is a question you will ask your whole life. It is not a question you can answer in kindergarten. You can't even wrap your head around it in kindergarten. Who am I changes daily. It changes yearly. It changes every decade, right? So it is so insidious what they are doing and trying to put children in these boxes and tell them that the most important thing about them is not their skills, not their compassion, not their empathy, not the thing not their cello playing that they struggled for years to learn. No, they want them to focus on their sexuality. And there's something very dark about that. It's very dark. I love all people, but I love people who show me that their worth is in what they are capable of doing and what they do, who they are, what they know, what they contribute, not who they want to sleep with. That's the last thing I want to know. And that's the last thing anybody should want to know about anybody else, because it's none of our business. And it's certainly none of the business of the adults in my kids' lives at school to be injecting that kind of nonsense ideology into their heads. And I could tell you about some of the fights I've had at the public school with my children, but I do believe that it's important for parents to stay engaged. Now, I was a homeschooler for years, but circumstances changed and I needed to put my kids in school. And they went to private Catholic school for a while. And then after 8th grade, there's no private school I can afford. So they have to go to public school. And it is possible to put your kid in public school still even today and make them respect your boundaries when it comes to this sexual perversion. We still have the freedom of religion in this country, and people don't use it enough. They just don't use it enough. And even if you're an atheist, you have the right for your children not to be inculcated into a cult when they go to public school. And I've had to use a lawyer to get it done, but it can get done. All you need to do, and someone you should really speak to is Alvin Louis from Courage is a Habit. He is amazing. He's doing.
We've had Alvin on.
Oh, good. Well, he's one of my besties, and he and I have been working together on how to help parents to navigate this system, because you do still have rights. You have a right to raise your child in your own faith system, in your own belief system, in your own cult if you want to. Okay, then let's just be completely honest. I'm a Catholic. My culture and my family's culture is Catholic. And I went to the school before I put them in, and I sat down with the superintendent and I told him that. And I said, if you or anyone else here tries to indoctrinate my children into a cult, an LGBTQ, WTF cult, I don't care what it is, but a rainbow, if they come home with rainbows, they come home, any of this stuff, you will hear from my lawyer. I'm telling you now, listen to me closely. I will treat it like I were a Muslim family whose child was forced to eat bacon. Would you do that to a Muslim child? And it was amazing. He goes, wow, that's a good analogy. I said, yes, it is, because it's the same thing. We're Catholics. This is against our religion. My child will not be shamed or pressured into joining any of these groups. I don't like the safe space stickers on the doors either, because what that says to my child is this room is only safe for those kids, not you. If you have a different attitude, if you have a different belief system, it's not safe here for you. Like if I were a teacher at a public school, could I bring my kneeling bench and my altar and my statue of Mary and my Jesus candles into my classroom and say, this is a safe space for Catholics, let's pray the rosary together? No way would they allow that in a public school. But they allow this nonsense LGBTQ cult stuff, because it is a cult. It's a belief system. This is no longer about sexual orientation. It has not been about sexual orientation for a long time, because everyone's like, you're here, you're queer, and no one cares, right? No one cares anymore. We don't need any of this. But they started doing it with the gender stuff just so that they could this is so insidious. It's worse than when it started. By a lot, because there are lots of gay people. Go check out Gays Against Groomers, by the way. Lots of gay people who are saying, this has nothing to do with us. This gender baloney cult stuff has nothing to do with LGBT people. It's not an orientation. It's a mindset. And that's a belief system. And therefore, that's a religion. And that's how we need to attack it in schools. That's how we have to attack it. We must attack it from the point that our children are not going to be indoctrinated into a cult while they're at public school.
Heck, and I couldn't agree more. You referenced Alvin Louis. We've had him on. Nobody does it better as far as talking about how they capture the language and how they use our kindness against us. And it turns out you are very familiar with Dan Kleinman. We just had him on because you wrote a book. Your first book is about the battle that you encountered in a library, that libraries are no longer a neutral place, but a place where a lot of grooming is taking place. So I'd love to talk to you about your first book and also the second book, because it talks about the mindsets, what's happened in terms of cultural shift. Can you stay with us for a second part?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to picking up right here where we're leaving off. Brad, thank you as always.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Megan. We'll come back with part 2. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Thanks for watching, and don't forget, like, share, subscribe, and always check out our website at unmaskingthetransmovement.com. I'll see you next time.